This liturgy, the third Sunday of Easter, has a special place in my heart because it's the liturgy that I celebrated for my first Mass. Last year on May 4th, after having been ordained as a priest in the Cathedral Basilica of Christ the King in the morning, and then after a celebratory reception in McNally Hall, just underneath in the basement of the cathedral, I drove over to St. Matthew's Parish in Oakville, my internship parish, to celebrate the 5 p.m. Mass. And on that day, I said and sang the very same prayers as I'm praying today. And I remember it like yesterday, my first day as a priest, my first half day as a priest, maybe. Since you weren't able to be there, but I have a little video of my first Mass and reception, I'm going to arrange that there'll be a little link in the YouTube description underneath the video later on today, where you can see a little highlight reel of that day. I still remember that day, looking out at the smiling and encouraging faces of family and friends and hearing the speeches that people said at my reception. I felt the peace, the love, and the joy of Jesus just filling me that day. I'll never forget it. And moment by moment, my priesthood started seeming to be drawn out of me without me even seeking for it. Father, can you hear my confession later on? Father, can you give me your blessing? Father, come over here. I want to talk to you. And on that day, I especially remember that at my first Mass, as I said the words of consecration, this is my body, this is my blood, I truly cried. I cried as I said those words because I could barely believe that I was now able to do this, that I was, after all these years, able to transform, through the priesthood of Jesus given to me by my bishop, bread and wine into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, truly present in the most blessed sacrament, the Eucharist. And this presence of Jesus in the Eucharist is often what we call the real presence of Jesus. And ever since that day, I continue to pray that the Lord will never allow me to take for granted this gift that I have in the breaking of the bread, that we see Jesus reveals himself to the disciples at the end of their journey. The real presence of Jesus, though, is a very kind of contentious thing in today's world, because actually recent polls suggest that maybe only a third of people who identify as Catholics actually believe what we really believe as Catholics, that is, that Jesus Christ is really present, that it's the same Jesus who walked the earth 2,000 years ago, who appeared to these disciples on the road to Emmaus, who shed his blood for you and me, the same Jesus we believe will come at this Mass on this altar, and who spiritually wants to enter your heart today through spiritual communion, through all the ways he wants to appear to you in your life. The Catechism says in section 1324 these words: "The Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. The other sacraments, and indeed all ecclesiastical ministries and works of the apostolate, that is our outreach, our work to serve and evangelize, they're all bound up with the Eucharist and are oriented toward it. For in the Blessed Eucharist is contained the whole spiritual good of the Church, namely Christ himself, our Pasch." And so the Eucharist is really the center, the source and summit of our faith. St. John Marie Vianney says, "All the good works of the world are like grains of sand compared to a mountain, and the mountain represents the Holy Mass." Because our good works are our good works. But the Holy Mass, that's God's work. That's his sacrifice made present. St. Irenaeus, therefore, an early father of the Church, says that our way of thinking needs to be attuned to the Eucharist. And I think that's what the readings of today really highlight for us. We see it on the walk of the disciples. They're meeting Jesus, and they're walking with him as he opens the Scriptures. That's what happens for the first half of the Mass, what we call the Liturgy of the Word. We're with Jesus. He's breaking open. He's reading the scriptures. And through the homily, we pray that we will come to a deeper understanding of those scriptures. But then, Jesus is preparing us for the summit of our faith, which is Holy Communion. Because the Eucharist is Jesus. As Father Lobsinger says all the time, and as you might have seen in his recent electronic Fridays with Father, that the Eucharist is Jesus and Jesus is God. If a person doesn't know this, a Catholic doesn't live like this is true, then they're really kind of off. They really haven't got what Jesus wanted. And I want to share briefly how the Eucharist is connected with what I'm going to call today the three joys of Easter. The first joy of Easter is that we have so much evidence for Christ's resurrection, and don't worry, I'm not going to launch into a big talk on it. But by standards of ancient biographies, the historical evidence for the events of Jesus' resurrection stand apart. But for us, it's not just a historical thing, because we meet this Jesus. Again, this Jesus who lived, healed, transformed the lives of so many people comes to us in the Eucharist. The Council of Trent says this: Jesus is really, truly, substantially present under the appearance of bread and wine. So when you think about this, what a joy it is that we can have this relationship with Jesus. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Jesus didn't have to do that. Have you ever taken the Eucharist for granted? Have you ever not really showed enough reverence or love for the Eucharist, which is the source and summit of our faith? Maybe especially now when we can't come to the Holy Eucharist as we'd like to, we're feeling the pain. We're feeling the separation, the longing, the holy longing for Jesus. The joy of Easter, Christ's resurrection, is that we can have this communion with Jesus, and that he actually wants to come to us, to be with us, to walk with us, he who shed his precious blood for us, as St. Peter reminds us. So the first joy of Easter is that this risen Jesus is not just a historical thing. He loves you. Stop and think about that today. He wants to be one with you in this sacrament. The second joy of Easter is that we get to every Sunday relive the resurrection. We often say that every Sunday is like a mini Easter. Do you treat every Sunday like a mini Easter? The church teaches that we're called to spend Sundays especially not only going to Holy Mass as you are right now, but praying, worshiping, praying as a family, spending time as a family, having time for holy rest, holy leisure, trying to perhaps do the spiritual and corporal works of mercy, feeding the sick, the hungry, caring for those who have no one to care for them, calling someone who might feel isolated or alone, especially today. All of these ways are ways of living Sunday as the Lord's day. It's one of the 10 Commandments, right, was to keep the Sabbath holy. For us, that's the Lord's day, Sunday. How well have you been doing in keeping the Lord's day holy? Do you think there's anything the Lord is asking of you to make it more holy? To make all of your Sunday, in one way or another, in all our lives, about Jesus, the risen Jesus who wants to be one with us? Do you take the opportunity to reach out to those who need your help, to serve them, to pray for them, to be a witness in your family of the resurrection of Jesus? What a joy that we have to be able to come to live each Sunday as a day of Easter. Easter is a joyful day. The Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith, and that's what we celebrate, especially on Sunday. So the first joy of Easter, that we can experience communion with the resurrected Jesus, not just a historical reality. The second joy of Easter, that we can live this great day of the Lord's Day and keeping it holy, find its true spiritual joy through communion with Jesus, through prayer, worship, and service. The third joy of Easter is that Christ's resurrection reminds us of our heavenly homeland and our relationship with what we say in the Creed, the communion of saints. Because each of us longs for us to get to heaven one day. We want everyone to go to heaven. Well, it's through the Eucharist that we prepare ourselves for heaven. It's our viaticum, our food for the journey, that strengthens us on the way. It's our manna in the desert of life, so that we can be fed and strengthened, but we can be strong enough to enter our promised land of heaven. St. Thomas Aquinas says that receiving this sacrament is necessary for salvation. He actually says that. He says there's two ways to receive it: the actual sacrament or the desire for the sacrament, that they would desire this communion with Jesus. That's in the third part of his Summa Theologiae, question 80. Christ's resurrection reminds us that we get to go to heaven if we follow him. If we follow him. No one gets to heaven until they're ready to love God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. To not only walk the path of heaven themselves, but to help others to walk that path. Jesus wants to share with us his divine life. He wants us to live forever in a glorified body, immortal, free of suffering, experiencing all the benefits of his own resurrected body. How joyful, how exciting that Easter promises this if we follow Jesus. We have to open ourselves to surrendering to his will for our life. Until we can surrender to God's plan for our life, we're not ready to enter into heaven. And yet it's the Eucharist that strengthens us to surrender more deeply, to surrender anything in our life that may be not what God is calling us to be. And just like those who walked with Jesus on the road to Emmaus, after they meet him, they go back, they turn around, they change their life. That's what's meant to happen to us at every Holy Eucharist. And so, what a great joy we have, this Eucharist, the source and summit of our faith, that prepares us for heaven, that we can eventually, as the reading from St. Peter says today, we're kind of in a sojourn, we're in an exile. In the Hail, Holy Queen, we say this is a valley of tears. It's very joyful, but it's not like heaven. It's the Eucharist, it's the grace of God that strengthens us on that journey. And what a joyful thing that we can have heaven. Have you ever stopped and thought about that? Jesus didn't need to open heaven for us, but he did it because he loves you. He wants us there. So Jesus is truly present in the Most Holy Eucharist. And so sadly, many of our Catholic brothers and sisters, and of course those outside of our faith, don't know this. They don't know the risen Jesus is waiting for them in this great sacrament. Will you be an apostle of the Eucharist? Will you witness to the Eucharist's importance in your life, not only by attending Mass, but witnessing to your faith? Millions of people throughout the centuries have died in order to have the Holy Eucharist or bring it to someone else. That shows how important this great sacrament is. And so as we continue this great, joy-filled season of Easter, let us continue to have this Eucharistic spirit and to remain close to Jesus, who loves you. He loves you. He wants to be one with you. He wants you in heaven. He wants to have an encounter with you every day. He wants you to have such a closeness with him. So I encourage you to make spiritual communions every day. And you don't have to make just one. Some people say that, but many of the saints did them many times a day. St. Maximilian Kolbe, who's actually depicted here on our wall here in St. Joseph's Chapel, he made a spiritual communion every 15 minutes. And he encouraged others to do the same. And Jesus asked many other saints to do the same. And again, St. Thomas Aquinas says we can receive Jesus spiritually in this way, just by our desire. St. Alphonsus Liguori says if we desire Jesus to come into our soul and we believe he has come, then we have made a spiritual communion. And so every time we do that, God's grace comes into our heart. We invite him to reign in us so we can be with him in heaven. The Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith. Everything flows from and to the Eucharist. If it doesn't, it probably needs to be reordered. And so this Sunday, let's recommit to a joyful and Eucharistic way of life, always seeking to be in communion with this Jesus who is not just a historical reality, always seeking to keep the Lord's Day holy and sacred as the sacred day that Jesus has made it to be by his resurrection. And also let us continue to live in a way that leads us and those around us to the joy of heaven, to eventually join the communion of saints in the fullness of paradise. During this time of pandemic, let us continue to draw close to Jesus spiritually, make our hearts a chapel for the Lord, invite him to live in us, and bring all our prayers to him always there wherever we may find ourselves. I close with the words of St. John Marie Vianney, who is the patron saint of priests, and I think his words are especially appropriate for you and I today. When we cannot go to the church, let us turn towards the tabernacle. No wall can shut us out from the good God.